my son looked me in the eye and told me to get out of his life. No shouting, no hesitation, just cold, final words that cut deeper than any knife ever could. I stood there, frozen, wondering how the boy I had raised, the boy I had worked myself to the bone for, could throw me away so easily. At that moment, I didn't argue. I didn't beg. I didn't even let him see me cry. I just nodded, turned around, and walked out of the house without looking back. But what he didn't know was that my quiet exit was only the beginning. For years, I had been saving, investing, building a future not just for myself, but for him. And now all that money, all those sacrifices, all those sleepless nights were mine to control. And I knew exactly what I wanted to do with them. I sold everything, donated most of what I owned to causes that actually mattered, and left behind a legacy that would shake his world to its core. I wanted him to feel the weight of what he had lost, but also to see the man I truly was. Someone who believed in giving, in building, in leaving this world better than I found it. When he finally discovered the truth after I was gone, it wasn't just an inheritance he received. It was a challenge, a test of character, a chance to become the man I had always hoped he'd be. I may have walked out of his life that day, but the lesson I left behind would stay with him forever, forcing him to decide what kind of person he truly wanted to be. I was never a rich man by choice, but I knew the value of every dollar I earned. My mornings began before the sun rose, the quiet stillness of dawn my closest companion as I sipped bitter coffee and packed my worn leather lunchbox. My hands were calloused from years of labor. My back ached from carrying more than just heavy loads. I carried dreams, hopes, and the weight of a future I wanted to give my son. I lived in a modest house, nothing fancy, but everything in it had a story. The creaky floorboard near the kitchen was from the day I rushed to fix a broken pipe myself because we couldn't afford a plumber. The old wooden table had scratches from when Julian was little, carving shapes with a butter knife despite my warnings. Every mark, every corner of that house was a memory, a testament to the years I spent building a life from almost nothing. I wasn't perfect, but I was present. I made sure my son never went to bed hungry, even if it meant I skipped dinner. Julian had been my pride from the moment I held him. I worked long shifts to pay for his schooling, for the guitar lessons he begged for the shoes he wanted so he wouldn't feel left out among his friends. Every time I clocked into work, I reminded myself that this grind wasn't just for me, it was for him. And for a long time, I believed he understood that. When he was younger, he'd sit at the kitchen table waiting for me to come home, showing me his drawings or the homework he'd proudly completed. He used to say, "One day, Dad, I'll buy you a big house so you won't have to work anymore." I would smile and tell him I didn't need a big house, just his love and respect. As the years passed, something shifted. Maybe it was the friends he kept. Maybe the world around him made him believe my simple ways were outdated. Maybe I just didn't know how to connect with him anymore. He went off to college, and though I paid for every semester without complaint, our conversations grew shorter, more strained. He started speaking to me like I was an obligation, something to check off a list. I tried to understand. After all, every young man wants to find his independence, but I never imagined he would grow to resent me. My evenings were quiet. After work, I'd sit in my favorite chair by the window, reading the newspaper or going over my notes on investments. It was my little secret that I had been putting money away for decades. Not just savings, but stocks, a retirement plan, and even a small portfolio of properties I had carefully managed. I never flaunted it, never mentioned it to Julian because I wanted him to grow up valuing hard work, not waiting for an inheritance. I believed that if he saw me living modestly, he would learn humility, gratitude, and strength. Our town was small, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The neighbors would wave as I trimmed the hedges, and I'd spend weekends fixing things around the house, repairing what was broken instead of replacing it. There was a certain pride in that, knowing that I could rely on my own two hands to keep things running. On Sunday mornings, I'd head to the diner on Main Street for breakfast, where the waitress always knew my order: black coffee, eggs, over easy rye toast. Sometimes Julian would come along when he was younger, swinging his legs under the booth, asking questions about everything he saw. Those were the moments that made me believe I was doing everything right. But time has a cruel way of showing you what you've missed. When Julian started working his first real job, I thought it would bring us closer. Instead, it seemed to create distance. He looked at my old truck with embarrassment, at my clothes with quiet judgment, at my simple life with a kind of disdain he never voiced outright. At least not until the night everything changed. I wasn't blind to the signs. The way he sighed when I gave him advice, the way he avoided eye contact when I asked him to sit down and talk. I kept telling myself he'd come around. That once he saw how much I cared, how much I had done for him, he would realize the depth of my love. But deep down I knew I was losing him. The house felt different those days too. Colder. The walls that had once echoed with laughter now stood silent. I'd find myself walking into his room, now empty, except for the bed and a few leftover books, remembering the nights I used to read to him until he fell asleep. I remembered patching up his knee after he fell off his bike, teaching him how to tie a tie for his first school dance, holding him when he cried after his first heartbreak. All those moments were still fresh for me, but for him, they seemed to have faded away. There was one thing I always told myself: no matter what happened, I would never stop loving my son. That love was what kept me going, what kept me working late shifts even when my body begged me to rest. But love can be a lonely thing when it's not returned. I'd sit alone at the kitchen table some nights, staring at the chair across from me, imagining what it would feel like to have him sit there again and talk to me like he used to. I was not a man of many friends, not because I didn't want them, but because I poured everything I had into being a father. My world revolved around making sure Julian had more than I ever did. My coworkers knew me as reliable, steady, maybe a little quiet, but always willing to lend a hand. They didn't see the weight I carried home with me, the worry that I was failing the one person who mattered most. I told myself that if I just kept working, if I just kept being there, things would get better. I'd save up enough to retire early, maybe take Julian on a trip somewhere, just the two of us like we used to do when he was little. Maybe that would remind him of who we used to be. Maybe that would make him see me again. Not just as some man taking up space in his life, but as his father, his friend, his biggest supporter. But the truth was, I was running out of time. My hair had turned gray, my knees ached more than ever, and I could feel the years catching up with me. I had built a life around the idea of passing something meaningful on to my son, but I didn't know if he would even want it. Still, I couldn't stop preparing. Every document I signed, every decision I made was with him in mind. It was all for Julian, even when it felt like he didn't care. The night it happened was quiet, too quiet. I had just come home from work, tired, but hopeful that maybe Julian would stay for dinner. He had been distant lately, always finding reasons not to be around, but that evening he was sitting at the table scrolling through his phone. For a moment I felt a spark of hope. Maybe we could talk. Maybe I could finally bridge the gap that had been growing between us. I sat down across from him and asked about his day. He didn't look up, just muttered something under his breath. I tried again, mentioning how I'd been thinking of taking a weekend trip. Just the two of us like old times. That's when he sighed, put his phone down, and looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Tired, irritated, almost angry. "Dad," he said, his voice sharp and cold. "I can't keep doing this. I can't keep pretending everything's fine when it's not. You don't get me. You don't get my life. Honestly, you need to get out of my life." At first, I didn't understand what he meant. Get out? Was he joking? I stared at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "What are you talking about?" I asked quietly. He leaned back in his chair and shook his head like he'd been holding this in for months. "You've done your job. You raised me. You gave me what you could. But I don't need you anymore. I need space. I need to live my own life without you breathing down my neck. You just don't fit into it anymore." I felt the air leave my lungs. This was my son. My Julian. The little boy who used to climb into my lap and ask me to read him stories. And now here he was, telling me I no longer belonged. The kitchen suddenly felt colder, like the very walls were closing in. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking of the clock, every sound magnified in the silence that followed. I wanted to fight back, to tell him how much I had sacrificed, how much I had given up so he could have everything. I wanted to remind him of the nights I stayed up sewing holes in his shoes because I couldn't afford new ones at the time, or the times I skipped meals so he could eat. But the words wouldn't come. All I could do was nod slowly, my throat tight, and say, "If that's what you want." Julian looked relieved, like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders, and that hurt more than the words themselves. He got up, grabbed his keys, and walked out the door without looking back. I sat there for a long time after he left, staring at the empty chair, wondering where I had gone wrong. Over the next few days, we barely spoke. He stayed out late, avoided me when he came home, and when he did speak to me, it was curt and distant. It became painfully clear that he meant what he said. He truly wanted me gone. That realization was like a knife twisting in my chest. I had built my entire life around being a father, and now that role was being stripped away from me. At work, I went through the motions like a ghost. My coworkers noticed I was quieter than usual, but I just told them I was tired. Inside, I was breaking. Every time I came home to find the house empty, it felt like a piece of me was missing. I would sit at the kitchen table long after the sun went down, staring at the door, half hoping he would walk in and take it all back. But he never did. One evening, I overheard him talking on the phone in his room. His voice was casual, even cheerful, as he told someone that he couldn't wait to get his own place and not have to deal with the old man anymore. The words stung, but they also made something in me shift. If he wanted space, if he wanted me out of his life, then I would give him exactly what he asked for, but I would do it on my terms. I began to withdraw quietly, packing up my personal belongings when he wasn't home, making calls to lawyers and financial advisors, setting things in motion. I didn't tell him what I was doing, didn't argue, or plead. I simply prepared. Every night as I sat alone, I thought about the kind of legacy I wanted to leave behind. If my son wanted me gone, I would make sure that when I left, I would leave something behind that he couldn't ignore, something that would force him to think about who he was and what kind of man he wanted to be. It wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure that the years I had spent working, saving, and sacrificing weren't wasted. I wanted my departure to mean something, to teach him one last lesson, not through lectures or arguments, but through action. The more I thought about it, the more determined I became. I sold off small assets first, then bigger ones, quietly liquidating parts of my portfolio. I began donating to charities that mattered to me, organizations that helped struggling, families, funded education for underprivileged kids, and supported causes I knew would make the world better. Each donation felt like a small piece of my heart being put to good use. There were moments when I hesitated, wondering if I was doing the right thing. Part of me still longed for Julian to come home one night, sit across from me, and apologize. Part of me wanted to believe that we could fix things, but the other part knew that waiting for that day might mean waiting forever. I realized that my life couldn't revolve around waiting for someone else to see my worth. If Julian couldn't see it now, maybe he would see it later, after I was gone, after he was forced to confront the choices he made and the man he had become. The conflict was no longer just between me and my son. It was inside me, a battle between holding on and letting go, between clinging to what I had lost and creating something meaningful out of the pain. And in the end, I chose to act. I chose to turn my heartbreak into something that might one day open my son's eyes. The first night after I decided to go through with my plan was the hardest. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the empty chair across from me, my fingers tracing the worn wood grain, remembering all the meals we had shared. There, I could still see Julian as a little boy, his hair sticking up in the mornings, laughing at silly jokes while eating cereal. Now that same chair stayed empty, the laughter gone, replaced by silence so heavy it felt like it was pressing down on my chest. The house, once full of warmth, had turned into a reminder of everything I had lost. I felt like a stranger in my own home, as if I no longer belonged there. In the following days, my determination hardened. If I was going to leave, I wanted to do it in a way that mattered. I spent hours with my lawyer, drafting a will that reflected my final wishes. My fortune wasn't enormous, but it was enough to make a difference. I had quietly built it over years of careful planning, and now I wanted it to speak louder than I ever could. I divided everything carefully, ensuring that the bulk of it would go to charities and organizations that would use it to help others. Education funds for struggling, students, housing for veterans, shelters for abandoned children, all the things I knew could change lives. But I didn't forget Julian. I left him a portion too, though not without conditions. My letter to him became the most difficult thing I had ever written. I sat by the window late at night, rewriting it over and over until the words felt right. I didn't want to sound angry or bitter. I wanted to be honest, to tell him that I loved him, that I had always loved him, but that I couldn't stay where I wasn't wanted. I wanted him to understand that money wasn't the point. The point was what he chose to do with. As I wrote, memories kept coming back. The time I stood in the rain for hours waiting for him to finish football practice because the car had broken down, and I didn't want him walking home in the dark. The night he was sick and I stayed up beside his bed, changing cold compresses and whispering stories to help him fall asleep. The first time he called me Dad with pride in his voice. Each memory was a reminder of how deeply I had loved him and how much it hurt to feel like that love no longer mattered. Julian didn't notice what I was doing at first. He was too busy with his own life, spending time with friends, working, late coming home only to sleep. Sometimes he'd pass me in the hallway without saying a word, and I'd wonder if this was how our lives would stay forever. Two strangers sharing a house, waiting for the day we could finally cut ties completely. That thought hurt, but it also pushed me to keep going. One afternoon, while he was out, I began packing my personal belongings. Not much, just the things that mattered to me. Old photographs, a few books, my father's watch, and the letter I had written for Julian. As I boxed them up, I felt an unexpected calm settle over me. For the first time in months, I felt like I was doing something that gave me back a sense of control. There were moments, though, when my resolve wavered. Some nights I would hear his car pull into the driveway and hope that he might come inside, sit down and talk to me. I imagined what it would be like if he apologized, if he told me he didn't mean what he said. In those moments, my heart ached with longing, but I reminded myself that I couldn't force him to care. Love has to be freely given, not demanded. Then came the day I overheard him on the phone again. His laughter was carefree, his words cutting. He joked about how soon he'd be rid of the old man and free to do whatever he wanted. I stood frozen in the hallway, every word like a hammer striking my chest. That was the moment any lingering doubt inside me disappeared. Whatever I had been holding on to, whatever hope I had left, it shattered. I knew then that leaving wasn't just an option, it was necessary. The emotional weight of what I was doing grew heavier by the day. At work, I found myself distracted, my mind always drifting back to Julian, wondering if he would hate me for what I was leaving behind or if he would finally understand. I carried that question like a stone in my pocket, heavy and impossible to ignore. Each night as I finalized my plans, I felt a strange mixture of grief and determination. Grief for the relationship we once had, for the boy who used to run to me when he was scared. Determination, because I knew I couldn't let this pain be the end of my story. If I was going to disappear from my son's life, I would do it with purpose, leaving something behind that would outlast both of us. I began making visits to the charities I had chosen, talking to the people who would carry my legacy forward. Their gratitude reminded me why I was doing this. It gave me a sense of peace I hadn't felt in a long time. Maybe Julian didn't see me now, but one day, when he read my letter and saw what I had done, maybe he would understand. The closer I got to completing everything, the more conflicted I felt. There were nights when I couldn't sleep, lying awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if I was punishing him or protecting him. I'd turn over in bed and remember when he was just a toddler, when he'd crawl into my arms without hesitation and fall asleep on my chest. The thought that this was the same boy who now wanted me gone made my chest tighten. I had to keep reminding myself that this wasn't about revenge. It was about setting him free, even if it meant setting myself adrift, too. Julian began to notice changes around the house. He'd walk into the living room and see boxes stacked in the corner, or notice that certain things had gone missing. My tools, my books, a few framed photos. One evening, he asked in a casual tone, "Are you moving or something?" I looked at him for a long moment, then simply said, "Something like that." He shrugged and went back to whatever he was doing, not realizing that each box carried years of memories I was carefully packing away. There were moments when anger bubbled up inside me. I'd catch myself gripping the edge of the kitchen counter until my knuckles turned white, thinking about the way he had dismissed me, how easily he had told me to get out of his life. I had given him everything and he couldn't even spare me a little kindness. But then I would breathe, close my eyes, and let the anger drain away. I didn't want bitterness to be the last thing he remembered about me. I wanted him to look back and see strength, dignity, and purpose, not rage. I visited the cemetery where my parents were buried, standing in front of their graves for a long time. I told them what I was planning, how I hoped this would be my last gift to my son, even if he didn't see it that way right away. In that quiet place, surrounded by headstones and whispering trees, I felt a strange comfort. Life was short too, short to spend begging for love that wasn't being offered. If Julian ever came to his senses, I wanted him to find me not broken, not bitter, but at peace with the choices I had made. The days felt longer as my departure grew closer. I found myself watching Julian when he wasn't looking, memorizing the curve of his jaw, the way his hair fell into his eyes, the way he laughed when something on his phone amused him. I knew that soon I wouldn't be there to witness these moments anymore. That knowledge cut deeply, but it also solidified my decision. He had asked for space, and I would give it to him fully and completely. One evening, after another day of quiet tension, I left a small stack of envelopes on my desk, each labeled carefully. One for the lawyer, one for the executor of my estate, and one for Julian. That letter was the hardest thing I had ever written, and as I placed it on the desk, I felt both relief and sorrow. It was my last conversation with my son, the last words he would ever receive from me. I prayed that when he read them, he would not just see the man who had left, but the man who had loved him enough to teach him one final lesson. Julian still didn't seem to grasp what was happening. If anything, he seemed lighter, as though the house growing emptier was a sign that he was finally getting what he wanted. I didn't resent him for it. He was too young to see what was really happening. The truth is, I envied his ability to move forward so easily, while I carried the weight of every memory, every sacrifice, every unspoken word. My friends began to notice my absence from the diner on Sunday mornings. One of them asked if everything was all right, and I simply nodded. I didn't want to explain. This was something I had to do alone, something deeply personal that no one else could understand. On the night before I left, I walked through the house slowly, room by room, touching the walls, running my hand along the banister, standing for a moment in each space to say goodbye. When I reached Julian's room, I paused at the doorway. It looked so different now, and the posters were gone, the shelves half empty. Still, I could picture him as a child, sitting on the floor playing with toy cars, looking up at me with wide eyes when I came home from work. I whispered a quiet goodnight even though he wasn't there to hear it. The next morning, I rose before dawn, packed the last of my things, and placed the letter where he would find it. The house was silent, bathed in pale morning light as I closed the door behind me. I didn't look back. My heart ached, but there was also a strange sense of freedom in finally letting go. What Julian didn't know was that this was not just me leaving the house. This was me leaving him a path to redemption. He would have to walk it himself, but I had given him the tools. Whether he used them was up to him. Julian found the letter 2 days later. At first he didn't think much of it, just a plain white envelope resting on the desk in the study, his name written in my careful, familiar handwriting. Something about it made him pause. The house was unusually quiet, and he realized he hadn't seen me since the morning before. A strange heaviness settled over him as he tore open the flap and unfolded the letter. "My son," the first line read, and he froze. I never started my notes like that. It felt formal, deliberate, as though every word had been chosen with precision. He sank into the chair and began to read, the world outside fading away as my voice came alive on the page. I told him that I loved him, more than he would ever truly understand. I told him that I had heard his words, and that I respected his wish for me to leave his life. I explained how I had quietly begun putting my affairs in order, selling my assets, donating most of what I owned to causes I believed in. I told him about the scholarship funds I had established in my parents' names, the food banks that would be stocked for the next year because of our contributions, the homes that would be built for veterans who had none. I wrote that I didn't do this to punish him, but because I wanted the sacrifices of my life to mean something, to ripple outward and touch lives beyond our own. Then I came to the part that made him set the paper down and stare blankly at the wall. I left him an inheritance, not everything, but enough to change his life. But there was a condition. Before he could access any of it for himself, a large portion had to be used to fund a community project of his choice. He had to be the one to oversee it, to choose where the money went, to see the faces of the people. It helped. Only then would the rest of the funds be released to him. Julian's hands shook as he continued reading. My words were calm, but there was an unmistakable weight to them. I told him I wanted him to learn what I had learned, that wealth was a tool, not a trophy, and that its true power was in how it could lift others. I reminded him of the little boy he used to be, the one who had once told me he wanted to grow up to help people like superheroes do. I wrote that somewhere along the way we both had lost sight of that dream, but that maybe this was our chance to find it again, even if I wouldn't be there to see it. When he finished reading, he sat there in silence, the letter trembling in his hands. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time in a long while, tears pricked at his eyes. He hadn't expected to feel this way. He thought he'd feel relieved when I was gone, free of what he saw as my judgment, my presence, hanging over him. Instead, he felt hollow. The quiet house didn't feel liberating. It felt empty. He stood and wandered through the rooms, noticing the absence of my belongings. The old watch that usually sat on the dresser was gone. My boots were no longer by the door. The house didn't just feel quiet. It felt abandoned. Memories crashed over him. Me teaching him to ride a bike in the front yard, patching up the scraped knee afterward, the smell of coffee and pancakes on Saturday mornings, the sound of my laugh echoing through these very walls. He sank onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. Later that evening, Julian drove to the lawyer's office, letter in hand. The lawyer explained the terms of the will, confirming everything I had written. Julian sat there stunned as he learned the full extent of the fortune I had built. It wasn't millions, but it was far more than he ever imagined I had. He couldn't believe that the man he had dismissed as living a small life had been quietly building something so substantial. That night, Julian returned home and sat at the kitchen table, my chair this time. He read the letter again, tracing the words with his finger. For the first time, he allowed himself to think about why I had done it this way. It dawned on him that this was not about control, not about one last attempt to dictate his choices, but about giving him a chance to grow into the man I had always believed he could become. The next morning, Julian visited the community center in town. It was old, rundown, and struggling to keep its doors open. He spoke with the director, listened to the volunteers, and saw the faces of children who came there after school for a safe place to play and learn. Something inside him shifted. For the first time in years, he thought about more than himself, about how much impact he could have if he took this seriously. As days turned into weeks, Julian threw himself into the project. He used the funds I had left to repair the building, buy new equipment, and create programs that would help kids learn skills and stay out of trouble. At first, it felt like just an obligation, something he had to do to access the rest of the money, but somewhere along the way, it became something more. He started staying late, organizing events, talking to parents, raising additional donations on his own. One evening, after locking up the center, he sat in his car and looked at my letter again. The tears came freely this time. "You knew," he whispered to the empty seat beside him. "You knew this is what I needed." The revelation hit him fully then. This was never about money. It was about him finding himself again. It was about reconnecting with the boy who once dreamed of helping people, the boy I had raised to be kind and strong. He realized he had been running from me because he saw in me everything he wasn't living up to, and instead of facing it, he had pushed me away. Julian drove to the cemetery that night and stood at my grave, the letter clutched in his hand. The cool night air was still around him as he knelt and whispered, "I'm sorry, Dad. I see it now. I see you." It wasn't an answer. Not yet, but it was the beginning of one. Julian stood there for a long time, the moonlight casting a silver glow over the headstone. The words carved into the granite felt heavier now, more permanent, like they were pressing against his chest. He brushed the dirt from the base and sat on the cold ground, speaking out loud as though I were sitting right beside him. "I thought I knew everything," he said, his voice low and shaky. "I thought you were just holding me back. But you were carrying me this whole time. I didn't see it. I didn't want to see it." His words dissolved into the night. Air, swallowed by the stillness. He stayed there until the stars began to fade, until the first streaks of dawn painted the horizon. When he finally stood, something in him had shifted. The next morning, Julian returned to the community center earlier than usual. He walked through the halls, running his fingers over the fresh paint, hearing the distant echoes of children's laughter from the day before. The place felt alive in a way it hadn't before, and it struck him that all of this, was possible because of me. The guilt he had been carrying weighed on him, but for the first time it didn't paralyze him. It pushed him forward. He called a meeting with the staff and volunteers, his voice steady but filled with a new kind of energy. "I want to do more than just fix this place," he said. "I want to turn it into something that lasts, something that changes lives for years to come." They looked at him with surprise. This was the same young man who had shown up reluctantly just weeks earlier, the one who treated this project as a box to check. Now he spoke with conviction, with purpose. Over the next several weeks, Julian poured himself into the work. He wasn't just writing checks anymore. He was out there every day, hammering boards, painting walls, handing out flyers to raise awareness and bring in volunteers. He met with local business owners to secure sponsorships, organized fundraisers, and even convinced the city council to allocate additional resources for the center. He worked until his hands blistered and his clothes were soaked in sweat, but he didn't care. Every drop of effort felt like a conversation with me, like he was proving to me that he understood. At night, when he returned home to the now empty house, he no longer felt the cold indifference he once carried. Instead, he felt the weight of responsibility, but it was a weight he welcomed. He would sit at the kitchen table, the same place where we had last spoken, and plan out the next steps for the center, writing late into the night under the soft glow of the lamp. Sometimes he would pause and whisper, "I hope you'd be proud of me, Dad." One weekend, the renovations were finally complete, and the center hosted a reopening celebration. The building was filled with life, children running through the halls, parents smiling, volunteers laughing. Julian stood quietly in the corner at first, watching it all unfold. Then the director called him to the front to speak. He took a deep breath, his hands trembling slightly, and faced the crowd. "I didn't do this alone," he began, his voice carrying over the chatter. "This was possible because of my father, a man I didn't always appreciate, a man I didn't always respect the way I should have. He believed in building a better future, and I nearly threw that away. This center, this second chance, was his gift to all of us." The room fell silent for a moment before the applause began. People clapped, some even wiped tears from their eyes. Julian felt his throat tighten, but he smiled through it because for the first time, he felt like he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Later that evening, after everyone had gone home, Julian stayed behind. The hallways were quiet again, but it wasn't the suffocating silence of the past. It was peaceful, almost sacred. He walked into the main room, sat on the floor, and pulled out my letter once more. By now the edges were worn, the folds soft from being opened so many times. He read it again slowly, savoring every word, letting it sink deeper into his bones. He realized then that this was only the beginning. The money I had left him was nearly gone, invested into the center and its programs, but he didn't care. He had discovered something far more valuable: purpose. He had spent so much of his life running from me, from what I stood for, and now he saw that everything I had done had been to prepare him for this moment. When he finally stood to leave, he didn't feel like the same man who had once told me to get out of his life. He felt older, wiser, humbled. The pain of my absence was still there, but it no longer felt like a wound. It felt like a reminder, a quiet voice urging him to keep going. Julian's transformation wasn't complete until the day he met the first family who benefited directly from the donations. It happened on a rainy afternoon, when he stopped by the shelter his father's funds had helped expand. A young mother stood in the doorway, holding a toddler on her hip, her clothes damp, but her eyes shining with gratitude. "Are you the one who made this possible?" she asked softly. Julian hesitated before answering. "I guess you could say that. But it was my father who started it all." The woman's face softened. She invited him inside, showing him the small warm room where she and her daughter now slept, a room that hadn't existed before the renovations. She told him how they had been living in their car for weeks before the shelter reopened its doors, how she had been terrified every night about keeping her little girl safe. "You saved us," she said simply, tears slipping down her cheeks. Julian stood there in silence, overwhelmed. It was the first time he truly saw the human face of what his father's legacy had done. The guilt that had been gnawing at him all, this time suddenly collided with something new: pride. His chest tightened not with pain this time, but with the weight of responsibility. "I didn't save you," he said finally, his voice low, "but I'll make sure we save a lot more people like you." When he left the shelter, the rain had stopped, and the clouds had broken just enough for a single shaft of sunlight to fall across the parking lot. He stood there, letting it warm his face, and felt a strange peace wash over him. It was as if his father was there with him, nodding in quiet approval. In the weeks that followed, Julian's commitment grew stronger. He started hosting community events at the center, job fairs, tutoring programs, health clinics. The work consumed him, but it was the kind of exhaustion that left him fulfilled, not empty. Every time a parent thanked him or a child smiled at him, he felt closer to me, as though with each act of kindness he was repairing the bridge he had once burned. One evening, long after everyone had gone home, Julian stayed behind to finish some paperwork. The building was silent except for the hum of the lights overhead. He pulled out my letter again, by now nearly falling apart, and read it one more time. This time, he didn't cry. Instead, he smiled. A small, bittersweet smile that spoke of acceptance. "You were right, Dad," he whispered into the empty room. "You were right about everything." That night he went home and stood in front of the mirror for a long time, seeing not just his own reflection but also hints of mine. The same tired eyes, the same determined set of the jaw. For the first time he felt proud of that resemblance. Soon after, he made a decision that would mark the final step in his transformation. He legally renamed the community center after me. The announcement was made at a small ceremony, attended by neighbors, volunteers, and families whose lives had been changed by the work done there. When the new sign was unveiled, reading, "The Connor Foundation Community Center," the crowd broke into applause. Julian stepped up to speak, his voice steady and clear. "This place isn't just a building, it's a promise. My father spent his life believing in hard work, sacrifice, and generosity. I didn't always understand him. I pushed him away. and I'll have to live with that for the rest of my life. But this center is how I honor him. It's how I make sure his lessons keep changing lives, mine included." The audience was silent for a moment, then a wave of applause swept through the room. Some people were crying openly. Julian stepped back, his heart hammering in his chest, but for the first time it wasn't from guilt, it was from pride. That night he returned to the cemetery. The grass was wet with dew, and the air smelled of rain. He knelt before the headstone and placed a small photograph of the new sign against it. "I kept my promise," he said softly. "Your name will live on. Not just here, but in every person this place helps. I can't undo what I said to you, but I can spend the rest of my life making sure I never waste what you left me." As he stood to leave, the wind stirred through the trees, and for a brief moment Julian swore he heard his father's voice. Not words, just the warm, familiar sound of his laugh. It stayed with him as he walked back to his car, a quiet reminder that even though Connor was gone, he was never truly absent. Julian woke up the next morning with a sense of calm he hadn't felt in months. For the first time since the day he told me to leave his life, he didn't feel the gnawing pit of guilt in his chest. Instead, there was a quiet strength, a clarity about what he needed to do next. He brewed a pot of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, my table, and let the steam rise in front of him as the morning light streamed through the window. This house, once a battleground of tension and unspoken words, now felt different. It no longer seemed like a prison. It was a memory, a starting point, and Julian realized he didn't need to run from it anymore. He spent the following weeks transforming his routines. The work at the community center continued, but he also began reconnecting with the people around him. He called relatives he hadn't spoken to in years, checked in on old friends, and started repairing relationships that had been neglected. It wasn't just about honoring my memory anymore. It was about living a life that mattered, a life that reflected the lessons I had tried to teach him all along. One evening, Julian sat down with a notebook and began writing his own letter, not to me, but to himself. He wrote about the man he had been, the mistakes he had made, and the person he wanted to become. He promised himself never to take love for granted again, never to push away the people who cared about him, and never to lose sight of what really mattered. When he finished, he folded the letter and tucked it into the back of my original one. Together, they became a symbol of the bridge he had built between who he was and who he was becoming. The center thrived under Julian's care. Within a year, it had expanded its programs, offering mentorship for at-risk youth, career counseling for struggling adults, and even a scholarship fund, one he named after both of us. When the first scholarship was awarded, Julian sat in the front row of the ceremony, watching as a young girl walked to the podium, tears in her eyes as she thanked everyone who had made her education possible. In that moment, Julian felt the weight of everything I had set in motion. He saw how one man's decision could ripple outward, touching lives far beyond what either of us could have imagined. But the most powerful moment came late one night, long after the building had emptied and the lights had been turned off. Julian stayed behind, sitting on the stage in the main hall, staring out at the empty chairs. The silence wasn't lonely anymore. It was full, alive, humming with the memories of all the laughter and conversation that had filled the space earlier that day. He took out the letter once again, running his thumb over the creases, and said softly, "You did it, Dad. You changed me." He thought about that final conversation we had, the one where he told me to get out of his life. For months it had haunted him, but now he understood it for what it was, the breaking point that had forced him to grow. Painful as it had been, it had given him the chance to become the man I had always hoped he'd be. He no longer wished he could go back and take back those words. He wished I could see how far he had come since saying them. As the months turned to years, Julian became known in the community as a leader, someone people could rely on. He wasn't perfect. He still made mistakes, still had days when grief hit him hard, but he carried those moments differently now. Instead of letting them crush him, he let them guide him. Each challenge became a chance to do better, to keep building. on the legacy I had left behind. He kept the house, but he changed it too. The walls were repainted, the garden replanted, the rooms filled with new life. He turned my study into a quiet library where anyone from the neighborhood could come to read or work. On the wall above, the desk where he had once found my letter, he hung a framed copy of it, not just as a reminder of what he had lost, but as a promise of what he had gained. Every year, on the anniversary of my passing, Julian hosted a dinner at the community center. Neighbors, volunteers, and families who had been helped by the programs all gathered to share stories and celebrate. At the end of each dinner, Julian would stand up and say a few words about me, about the man who had given everything he had so that others could have more. His voice would always catch a little when he said my name, but the smile that followed was steady and full of pride. One evening, after such a dinner, Julian stood outside the center, looking up at the sign that bore my name. The sky was full of stars, and for a moment he felt like he could hear my voice again. Not sad, not disappointed, but proud. "I get it now," he whispered. "I get what you were trying to teach me." Julian's journey had started with anger and ended with understanding. He learned that love was not about possession but about action, that respect was earned not by demanding it, but by living in a way that inspires it. He realized that my legacy was not just the money or the letter. It was the fire I had lit inside him, the one that would keep burning long after both of us were gone. In the end, Julian didn't just inherit my fortune, he inherited my purpose. And in carrying that purpose forward, he finally became the man I had always believed he could be. The man who didn't just exist for himself, but who made the world a little better than he found it. If this story struck a chord with you, take a moment to think about the relationships in your own life. How many times have we let pride or anger keep us from saying the words that matter? "I'm sorry. I forgive you. I love you." Connor never got to hear those words from his son while he was alive. But in the end, his legacy spoke louder than any argument ever could. Julian's journey is a reminder that sometimes it takes losing someone to truly see them, to finally understand what they stood for. Don't wait for that moment. Ask yourself, if someone you loved left you a letter today, what would it say? Would it be a message of gratitude, of forgiveness, of hope? Or would it be filled with unfinished business? You have the power to decide that right now. Call the person you've been avoiding, mend the rift, or simply tell someone that you appreciate them. Life is too short to leave things unsaid. If this story made you reflect, share it with someone who might need to hear it. Drop a comment below and tell us what you would do if you were in Julian's shoes. Would you rise to the challenge your loved one left you, or would you struggle to forgive yourself? Your stories inspire others more than you know. And if you want more powerful stories like this, stories that touch the heart, that challenge you to think, that remind you of what really matters, hit that like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There's another story coming next week that you won't want to miss, and it might just be the one that changes how you see the world.